Hello everyone, excuse me, it is Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. You may be noticing that I am playing the saxophone quartet version of my theme music, and that is, some of you might be able to guess why. If you're a jazz fan at all, you may have heard about the passing of Wayne Shorter, a saxophonist who I'm going to be talking about today. Let's see how much I talk about him. But he's he was an unbelievably influential musician, way out of proportion to what you might what you might understand if you're not really deep into this music. So I'm gonna be talking about Wayne Shorter. And his effect on music, some of his music, and how it plays out in other things, while also talking about some of the things we've been talking about anyhow. And it actually makes a really good contrast to talk about the things that we've been talking about in terms of chord voicings, traditional ways of voicing chords, and then talk about what Wayne Shorter brought to the table. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Wayne, and then we're going to flip over to look at some music with some chord voicings, and then look some more at Wayne's music. So Wayne Shorter was a saxophonist, and he came up like in the 50s and was playing with people like Art Blakey and other musicians who were steeped in a bebop tradition. You know, he played with Art Blakey, who played with Charlie Parker, right? That's his connection to that aspect of the tradition. And Charlie Parker was like this major pivotal figure in jazz that kind of separates out what you would consider traditional jazz from modern jazz. There's a sort of line at Charlie Parker. And I would claim that Wayne Shorter forms the next dividing line between modern jazz in the sense of Charlie Parker and more modern, right? So the word modern is silly. But, and so, I want to talk more as we go on about what that really means, how that plays out in the music, how you can take advantage of this. But Wayne's music was very not functional harmony. Was very much, I mean, he comes from a background of playing songs with 2-5-1s and clear key centers and, you know, all the kind of stuff that jazz had been about before Wayne. But he was the one who introduced a new way of looking at harmony. And I'm going to say that there's like a divergence here between a sort of a John Coltrane theme strain that also was around the same time of modal music. So when you hear me talk about like the Dorian scale and just improvising or whatever on one scale for long periods of time, modal improvisation, that was Coltrane's thing, and that's a direction to take things. Wayne took things in a different direction where there were a lot of chords, but they don't work together functionally. Instead, there's a sonic quality, like how one chord sounds next to another, and the way the voice leading connects chords that you would never in a million years have thought were going to connect. So, that's sort of a backdrop to what we're going to talk about. And so, although Wayne was a saxophonist, his influence, I mean, yes, he was an influential saxophonist, and a lot of saxophonists might, you know, have things they do in their playing that is Wayne Shorter-like. But it's really his musical conception, his compositions, and his approach to improvisation over chord progressions that, you know, influences all musicians since. And so his influence isn't just among saxophonists. In fact, it's not even primarily among saxophonists. I know almost no saxophonists who list him as a major influence on their own saxophone playing, but I know almost no composers who don't list him as a major influence on on their composition. So this is Wayne Shorter, like less short, right? Like faster, shorter. That's what it is. Wayne Shorter. So yeah, I can type that in here. Wayne Shorter. Whoops, I hit a wrong button here, obviously, but I meant to just type Wayne Shorter. There we go. So that's the backdrop to what we're going to talk about. But now I'm going to flip over and start talking about the more traditional approach to jazz chord voicings and so forth, and then talk about how Wayne kind of goes past this and where things go instead. So what I'm going to do is take a look here at John Foster's version of Best Things in Life Are Free, which was the project piece from the musicianship projects here. And he has gone through and written out all these voicings with thirds and sevenths and color tones. And I'm going to play through those and talk a little bit, not because his voicings I think are just fine, but I'm going to talk about why this style of voicing is a thing, and then contrast it with some Wayne Shorter things. So I'm just going to literally play well, I'll just let MuseScore play it so we can hear the melody and the voicings here. All right. Nice job, John. So, like most of those voicings are exactly the way I described them. There's a few that are off a little bit, and I'll talk about what's off about them. And when I say off, I mean they don't fit the exact model that I described. But they will actually serve as a nice bridge to talking about some Wayne Shorterisms. So the way I describe these voicings going, and this is the way all jazz pianists learn voicings, and not just pianists, but arrangers, anyone, guitar players, you basically learn to put thirds and sevenths kind of at the core of your voicing and then stack color tones on top or maybe somewhere in the middle, but there's different ways of doing this, but you get the third or the seventh as the foundation of the voicing with the root understood to be in the bass. So that's what we have here. We have the third and the seventh of the major seventh chord, and the color tone that I'm recommending adding is going to be a ninth or a 13th, and a 13th is the same as a sixth if you can't count to 13 like I can't. So this is the ninth. It's a whole step above the root. So third, the major seventh, and then the ninth. Okay. The next chord we have here, D minor 7 with a G in the bass. So there's the G in the bass. Third, seventh, ninth. Great. So the next chord, back to the same, third, seventh, ninth above. The next chord, G7, we have the third and the seventh, and this time the order is reversed, and that's for voice leading reasons. Remembering that term, we're going to hear about voice leading a lot today. We have the third here of the C chord, E, is right next to the seventh of the G chord. Yeah? And then also, the seventh of the C chord is common tone with the third of the G chord. So you get this two nice little bits of voice leading. Ba, ba, da, dum, and ba, da, dum. Right? So you get these two different voice leading things going on, and then so if we have the seventh going on the bottom, and this is this is the thing you do, you plan which note goes on the bottom based on voice leading. So if you have the third on the bottom, it's going to make sense to have a ninth on top as your color tone. If you have the seventh on the bottom, it makes sense to have the 13th on top. And this is all stuff that I go into much more detail about in the lessons for the workshop. So that's the basic idea, and then I give a couple different exceptions and things. So I want to talk now about the couple places where things are maybe not following that pattern and where we might want to do something different. So one of them is in this measure here. He has the seventh and the third, but he doesn't have a 13th on top. He just has the fifth on top. There's not really a particularly good reason for that. I'm not saying it's wrong, but, we generally like to have color on these chords. So if we're going to have this for a D minor 7, then we could have the 13th on top for the G7 as well. So that would be expected. And that chord happens a few times, like here it is again with the same thing. And he's got the E on top for other G7s, but for this one he doesn't. So I'm not sure if this is an oversight or if there's a particular thing that he was thinking about for that. But so that's one observation. Now, the next observation comes in on the next page. And so this is where we start to cross into possible Wayne Shorter-ish territory. What he has for the G minor 7 here, the 7th, the minor 3rd, and then a 13th, that follows that pattern, right? That sound right there is a lovely sound on its own. I mean, if you just hear it out of context, right, there's some dissonance, a tritone and a major 7th. So if you don't have the right context for it, you might think of it as a dissonant sound. But in the right context, it's a beautiful sound. And we're going to be hearing that same kind of sound more as we look at some more music today. But the observation that I made in the lesson is that this sound is not a sound that we would typically use on a 2-chord, right? This is a 2-5-1 in F. The whole song is in C, but this passage is 2, 5, or let me play it the way he's got it. 2, 5, 1 in F. He has a 2-5-1 in F. And on the 2-chord, we typically don't use that 13th. And this is something that most jazz pianists are kind of in agreement about, although we usually can't put into words exactly why. My putting it into words is this. This sound is very distinctive. Excuse me. It's very distinctive in part because of this tritone. We like tritones. The C7 has a tritone. But what's going on now is the G minor 7 has that same tritone, B flat and E. And so it's kind of making the G minor 7 sound a little too much like the C7. We like tritones a lot in jazz, but and not just in jazz. I mean, tritones are an integral part of any dominant 7th chord, whether it's jazz or not. The 3rd to the 7th is a tritone. But as soon as you put that tritone interval on some other chord, now it starts to make it sound a little too much like that dominant 7th chord. So this sound here feels very similar to the C7 sound. So typically, that's one of the few situations where we don't put a color tone on a chord, on a 2-chord. If the 2-chord had had the 3rd on the bottom, we'd go 3rd, 7th, 9th. It's not that 2-chords don't like color. They just don't like that particular color of that 13th. So typically, when playing a 2-5-1, we'll just use a 5th on top. And then here he has the 5th on top of the F chord, but that could have been a color tone. No reason that couldn't have been the color tone. So that's going on in a few other places. A few other places where he has 2 chords that have a 13th on them that doesn't belong there. Or I shouldn't say doesn't belong, but doesn't fit the model I gave for how to make a 2-5-1 sound like a 2-5-1. So I'm starting to pivot. I said that this sound here is a fine sound. It just makes it sound a little too much like the C7 that's about to come. So it's not that we don't like that sound here. It's a fine sound, but it makes it sound too similar to the C7. So if your music is based on 2-5-1s, then you don't want your 2 to sound too much like your 5, or you're missing out on something. But if your music is not based on 2-5-1s, suddenly that sound you can just appreciate for itself. This sound here is in fact the first chord of, am I going to get this right? It's the first chord of Blue and Green by Miles Davis. Kind of by Miles Davis, more by Bill Evans. This is the song Blue and Green by Miles Davis. Now, Miles Davis, so this particular chord, that's exactly the voicing that Bill Evans plays, I think, more or less exactly on the recording. So that version of the band, Miles Davis's band from the late 50s, Wayne Shorter was not in that band yet. But a few years later, Wayne Shorter joined Miles Davis's band, and that's really when all this all really started to take shape. The things I'm going to be talking about regarding Wayne, because he had been playing for years with Art Blakey, doing somewhat more traditional jazz kind of stuff with 2-5-1s and so forth. And Miles, after Kind of Blue, he had a couple interim bands, and in particular, he eventually had a band with Herbie Hancock on piano, who is still with us, Tony Williams on drums, who recently died, and Ron Carter on bass, who's still with us. The saxophonist in that band, they went through a couple different saxophonists, but the main one at first was George Coleman, who was more traditional also. And the story goes that it wasn't a good fit. I mean, I like that band. There's some great music from that band, but there was a sense that they wanted Wayne Shorter, particularly that Tony Williams wanted Wayne Shorter in that band and thought that it would open them up to some new harmonic possibilities. And that's eventually what happened. Wayne Shorter replaced George Coleman, and then that combination of Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock, they just influenced each other and their writing and their approach. And that is when music changed. Just not to put too fine a point on it, but jazz up until that point was based on 2-5-1s, or you had things like what Coltrane was going to be doing with all the modal stuff, just improvising for long periods on a single scale. But it was when Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock were working together in Miles Davis's group that they really started to discover new sonic possibilities for harmony. And these sonic possibilities were not based on 2-5-1s, but based on chords and their individual sounds and the voice leading of how they connected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over. So for licensing, copyright reasons, etc., I'm not going to actually play any videos of Wayne Shorter. Actually, there's no reason I couldn't do that. It'll just stick an ad on it. But every once in a while, if you play a copyrighted video during a video, it just gets like blocked by YouTube, and I don't want to see that happen here. So I'm not going to play any Wayne Shorter music other than me playing it on the piano, all right? But later I'll post links to some things that I think will be worth listening to. What I am going to do is show you, as soon as I find my folder, here it is. I'm going to play, excuse me, frog in the throat today. Play through a little bit of a couple different Wayne Shorter pieces and talk through them. So this is one of the very first Wayne Shorter pieces that I ever learned, and this is from that period of Wayne Shorter playing in Miles Davis's group. And so I'm going to play through this piece a little bit here, and then kind of talk about what's making it different. It's written with a key signature of 1 flat, which ostensibly means it's in F. And okay, it kind of sort of is in F, but let's listen to it. Okay, first of all, very first chord, E7. What is E7 doing in the key of F, right? Already we know, whoa, something funny is happening here. But I'm going to play. That's the tune. And the chords here are debatable. I actually played. These aren't the chords that I originally learned from it, for it. The original real book had different chords there, and then the next version of the real book had slightly different chords. One of the things that's going to go on here is that it's notoriously difficult to sort out what the chords are in a Wayne Shorter piece, especially if Herbie Hancock is playing the piano, because Herbie Hancock's voicings for this type of piece are not based on thirds and sevenths. The whole point of things like this, these voicings with thirds and sevenths, is to convey the sound, the functional sound of this. This is a 1 chord. I need to hear the third and seventh to understand its function. I need to hear the third and seventh to understand its function. The thirds and sevenths and the way they voice lead is all about establishing function, establishing 2-5-1 relationships, circle of fifth relationships, functional harmony relationships. But in this type of music, E going to F, I mean, I can like, if I needed to, I could come up with an explanation for this. Oh, in the key of A minor, E7 to F would be a deceptive resolution. And if that was the only funny thing going on in the piece, I would accept that. But then the next thing is E7 going to E flat. Well, that E flat chord has no business being in the key of F, right? E flat major 7 or E flat 6, 9, whatever. This is not a chord that belongs in the key of F. Again, the resolution from E7 to E flat I could explain as a tritone substitution if I was in the key of E flat. You know, so there's all sorts of things that if I micromanage each combination of two chords, I could say, oh, this one makes sense, this one makes sense, this one makes sense. But when you add it all up, it doesn't add up to a particular key. So the next chord after this E flat is D. And that D chord, again, doesn't really make sense in the key of F unless you're going to resolve to G minor. But does it? No. It resolves to E flat. Again, okay, it's a deceptive resolution, but we're having to really like stretch our brains to make any of this make sense. And then E7, and then F. Now, if you follow the bass line, that's some voice leading for you, right? That's what this music is much more about. It's much more about enjoying the sounds of the chords. This sound of a chord, of a D7 with a flat 9 in it, it's just got a lovely sound to it that he likes. And then, well, what happens if you take the D up a step and leave everything else the same? You get this. Do you like this sound? Well, maybe not, but if I take the F sharp and move it to G, now I like that one. And so, looking at ways of taking chords, moving one or two notes by a step to see what other chords can come from that, and putting a melody on top of it. In this case, the melody came down to the A. You know, it didn't have to, but that's what it happened. That is what it did. So this idea that we're connecting chords based on voice leading, if you just tried to randomly like come up with some voicing, your own voicing of a D7 and your own voicing of an E flat, they might not relate to each other well, but your task as a pianist then is to figure out interesting voice leading. In this case, because the roots are adjacent, it's pretty easy to come up with good voice leading. Everything's, you know, just take the root, move it a step, move the third a step, right? Root from D to E flat, third from F sharp to G, seventh from C to either a major seventh on the E flat or down to a sixth, because it specifically calls for a sixth chord here in this person's version of it. The point is that every note, or the fifth of the A to the fifth of the B flat, right? Every note is going to move very smoothly if the roots are moving by step. And so this particular piece is kind of exploiting that. But there's any number of pieces that don't do that. So I'm going to play you now a piece called Anna Maria. Actually, no, I'm not going to play Anna Maria. I'm going to play Infantize. This is probably the first tune that came, well, it is the first tune that came to mind when I thought about what I might want to talk about today, when I heard about Wayne Shorter, anyhow. So I'm going to play through these chords and the melody, and you'll see that there's some stepwise motion. I think that idea of stepwise bass motion is something that Wayne liked, and I realize I like a lot, and I think it's because if you take a chord and then just move the root a half step, you can get another interesting chord out of it. Or if you take a minor chord and move the root a half step, right? There's interesting things that happen if you move the root a step but leave other chord tones the same. They can kind of cause interesting things to happen. And there's a certain fascination that a lot of composers have, and I think a lot of it comes from Wayne. So I'm going to play through this melody here with the chords, and see if I can get that a little. I'll just scroll when it comes to the time. time. And that's the piece. And Rod, good to see you here. And we'll talk about your piece coming up too. Not today. I'll talk about it next time. So this piece. So first of all, you have to understand, if you're not familiar with jazz, when I play this thing and it's like 30 seconds long, this one was longer. That's not the entire composition, right? The whole composition consists of the melody and then the understanding that there's going to be a development section that is improvised, then a recapitulation of the original melody. So this is basically the theme. If you want to think about a jazz performance as being like a sonata, which it kind of is, a sonata form, you're going to have a theme, you're going to have some development that's improvised, and then you're going to recapitulate. You're going to repeat the original theme. So this is the theme. And so if you look at this thing, it's got that stepwise motion, but these chords all relate to a key, right? G minor to F minor to E flat all relate to the key of E flat. So we could certainly look at this and say, oh, that's just 3 going to 2 going to 1 in the key of E flat. Nothing special. But why would there be an A chord in the key of E flat? That doesn't necessarily make sense. Okay, if I know my theory, I could say, oh, A7 would then resolve to the 4 chord. It's a tritone substitution. It's, I would use all my jazz terminology to explain away the A7 if the A7 were going to go to A flat. But it doesn't. It goes to G flat. That is a resolution that has probably never happened in recorded history. That's a complete made-up statement. If you tried hard enough, somewhere you'll find an example of that. But this is a dominant 7th chord resolving down essentially a minor 3rd. The way it's spelled here, it's an augmented 2nd from A to G flat. But, had he called that B double flat 7, or had he called this F sharp major 7, and of course this isn't Wayne's chart. Wayne wasn't using MuseScore. This is a particular user who transcribed it, or copied it out of a real book from someone else who transcribed it. So that resolution of a dominant 7th chord down a minor 3rd, that's a pretty hard one to explain, right? There's no theoretical construct that I can easily put. I tossed around the idea of tritone substitution or deceptive resolution. There's certain terms that if you look at it a certain way, you can say, oh yeah, if a dominant 7th chord goes up a half step, that's like deceptive resolution in a minor key, 5 going to flat 6. If you see a dominant 7th chord going down a half step, that you can explain as tritone substitution for 5 to 1. But dominant 7th going down a minor 3rd, that is not a thing that normally ever happens. The time it would happen would be to a minor chord. If this A7 went to F sharp, that would be if we are in the key of D. And then we had 5 to 1. But if sometime instead of going 5 to 1, it went to 3, that would be another form of deceptive resolution if it went to F sharp minor. But it's not. It's going to G flat major. And we're not in the key of D. Nothing else anywhere around here suggests the key of D. So this is what I mean about non-functional harmony. We still have chords, but the chords don't relate to each other in a traditional functional way. So when we're voicing these chords, we don't necessarily care as much about things like which is a 3rd and which is a 7th and which is a color tone. All the notes that possibly would fit that chord, the 3rds, the 5ths, and the 7ths, but also 9ths and 13ths and 11ths and things, all become kind of fair game in producing voicings, and that's what Herbie Hancock really hung his hat on. The idea that, I don't have to base my voicings on 3rds and 7ths anymore. I can just find interesting voice leading, and he might voice that A7 chord like this, just these 3 notes, and then voice the G flat chord like that. So this is A7, this is the 3rd and 5th and flat 9, and then when we come to G flat, just move that one note. I'm not saying that's exactly what Herbie did on the recording. This was from Yeah, I forget what album this was from. It's on a couple different albums, actually, I think. So I'm not going to remember if Herbie played on one or both of them. But the point is, you can come up with these voicings that are not based on thirds and sevenths, but are just based on saying, hey, this has some of the right notes that I want to emphasize. And then if I move a note in a particular way, I get a set of notes that sounds nice on the next chord. And I don't care if it's got the third or the seventh in it, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Going from G flat to F, here I just had to move that note, right? G flat, I've got these three notes. Going to F, all I had to do was move this note to here. How did I know that? I don't know. You make it up as you go along. This is not following these preset recipes of third, seventh, ninth. This is about looking for voice leading possibilities. And the thing is, when Wayne wrote the tune, he worked out those possibilities. He knew what those voicings would be. But then we don't know, at least I don't know, what Wayne put down on paper for people to read. But probably it was chord symbols like this. Maybe he wrote out some voicings. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't write out some voicings that he knew he wanted a pianist to play. I wouldn't be surprised if especially later on when Wayne and Joe Zavino, another keyboard player, formed a band called Weather Report. That band had a different compositional sense to it, where there was less improvisation, more composition, more collective playing. I shouldn't say less improvisation, less soloing. You know, the jazz typical cliche is we do the head, the main melody, and then everyone takes turns improvising on that chord progression, and then we play the melody at the end. So one of Wayne Shorter's I won't call it a new invention or anything, but one of his hallmarks was saying, you know, we don't always have to improvise on the chord progression to the piece. We can have the piece, we can have our improvisation, but maybe I'm going to give you different chords to improvise over, not just the original chord progression for the piece. Maybe I've got some different chords. Or maybe I'm going to build improvisation into the structure of the piece. And that's, in other words, so it's not just head, solos, head, but the composition has bit of melody, bit of improvisation, bit of melody, bit of improvisation. This also, and that became more common in Wayne's writing in that band Weather Report. So I'm going to take a look at a piece from that period here. And this piece actually wasn't on a Weather Report album. It was on one of Wayne's solo albums, but from that same period, a little after the Miles Davis type of period. And I'm going to play through, this is only the first page. I've got the second page over here. So I'll cheat and look at it over here when we get there. But, you know, we're just looking at a sample from a thing to buy here, and I'm just going to play through it. So this piece has these little bits of improvisation built into the form of the piece. And then improvisation that happens later is really just based on a couple of the chords, a couple of the open sections, not on the full chord progression. But I'm going to play it, and you're going to hear a lot of the same things happening. You're going to hear little bits of things that one chord connecting to another you could almost believe had some functional reason to exist. And then other places where you're like, no, I'm sorry, I don't understand how those two chords fit together at all. And there's going to be some places where there's stepwise bass motion that it just sounds cool. So I'm going to play through this thing. These are those chords at the beginning. Now here we are at letter A. B. part you can't see. Kind of see it. Improvised based on those chords there. So this piece kind of exemplifies a lot of the things that I was just talking about. The idea, first of all, well, the new element of saying, hey, let's have bits of improvisation interspersed with melody. Instead of saying we're going to play a whole melody and then we're going to forget that melody while we improvise and then we're going to remind you of the melody again 5 minutes later, which is the typical jazz cliche thing. Wayne was one of the people who said, nah, let's get past that. Let's make the improvisation more integral to the piece. And so this is an example of that, of working in bits of improvisation in the cracks between phrases. And in doing this, notice that he's really doing a number of clever things. So the melody at letter A is virtually identical to the melody at the letter B, but check out how different the harmony is. Here's the music at the harmony at letter A. It's a G major, so it's going back and forth between G major and C minor, right? Whereas the next section is, it goes, instead of going to that C minor, it goes to this G7, and the melody is subtly adjusted, right? The original melody goes up to an E flat. But at letter B, it's essentially the same melody, but this time it goes to an E natural, so he has it harmonized differently. And the descending line stops on B flat, whereas the original descending line descends down to an A. So he's like, I want to reuse that melody, but I don't want to reuse it exactly. I want to make it different when I reuse that melody. So that's the same thing in the next phrase. He's got this G minor 7 going to C7. Hey, that's almost like a 2-5. That is a 2-5 if it went to F. But it doesn't go to F. There's no F chord in sight. But in the next version, it's also the 2-5. But this time it goes to a B flat chord. And it does hit an F, but it's an F minor chord, and it's got this other stuff in between, right? This is not functional harmony we're talking about here. And then that chord, and then that chord, none of those chords relate to the key of F. But that melody, you know, that use of the quarter note triplet figure over the C7 in the first part, but in the second part it's... So he's reusing material of his melody, but not copy and pasting it. That is just an important consideration. The next phrase that you couldn't really see starts on a C sharp instead of a D, but I'm going to play it here and look at the melody here. Actually, look at this version of the melody here. That melody I just played is this exact melody down a half step. Versus so it's the same melody a half step down, but harmonized differently. Here, the melody note is the 5th of that G chord. But in my second section here, Wayne's last section here, the melody note C sharp isn't harmonized. It's not just the same thing down. This would be... That would be the same thing, but that's not what he has. He doesn't have it harmonized with a G flat chord. He has it harmonized with a B minor chord. So it's that melody note isn't the 5th of the chord, it's the 9th of the chord. And then this note here, that melody note that he lands on in the original was the 9th, resolving to the root. But in the new version, this is an 11th of a minor chord resolving. So he's reusing that melody, but putting different harmonic context on it. I just can't emphasize how novel this was and how influential it is. The idea of taking bits of melody, harmonizing them in different ways, constructing a piece out of it, assembling different sections to it, having improvised sections within it. It's just unbelievably powerful as a compositional method, or sort of a structuring device. It's not so much a method as a structuring device. So, yeah, this piece, among others, is just really exemplary of this type of approach that I said is like you almost can't be a jazz composer today without paying a gigantic debt to Wayne Shorter. He's going to be a major influence on most jazz composers. So when I say that, I'm going to flip over to one of my pieces here. And this piece here is perhaps a good example because it is one of my most Wayne Shortery pieces in a lot of the ways that I'm talking about. It's still all me and I'm influenced by so many people, not just Wayne. But when I play through this, I can't play through the whole thing because it's a long piece, but it's going to show you those aspects. So I'm going to play little sections of it here. So first of all, it starts off completely notated. It's got 4 measures where I play exactly those notes. I didn't bother giving myself chord symbols. And then I've got melody with chord symbols, and then I've got a little improvised section, and then melody with chord symbols, little improvised section, right? You get the idea that this is already looking Wayne Shorter-esque. So here's, the title, As I Do, is Do As I Do, not as I say. But this was a piece that I wrote as a demonstration for a jazz theory course I was teaching. I was trying to impress on people this idea of creating longer form compositions. That wasn't just a head, 32 bars, and then improvise over the chords. I'm like, no, let's write pieces where you write a section, have some improvised stuff, write another section, have some improvised stuff, write another section that maybe relates to the previous section but isn't identical. That's not just a copy-paste job. So I was trying to impress on people this larger approach to form that Wayne was one of the people to do. Charles Mingus was another. So anyhow, here we go. A little bit further. Okay, so that's that section of the piece. And it goes on a lot more to it. But let's talk about what I just played and how it relates to what I've been talking about. So, first of all, if we look at these chord symbols here, you could look all day long. You're not going to find a whole lot of functional relationships there. There's not a lot in the way of 2-5-1s or anything like that. But just because I say there's not a lot doesn't mean there's nothing. So there's certain things that we can see, like this measure here, that F sharp to B minor, F sharp 7 to B minor. That's a 5-to-1 type of relationship. Here I've got C7, C7 to F. That's a 5-to-1 type of relationship, right? So there's bits and pieces of that, just like Wayne would have bits and pieces of recognizable relationships, but just not enough to really add up to a key. Now, if I look at other things, you'll see all these places where, do you recognize that? I do. I recognize that. This is ESP, right there. Right? It is that exact chord progression, those exact sounds. It's not like I deliberately referenced ESP in writing it. It's more that Wayne introduced that sound into our ears and made it a thing like 2-5-1s. This sound of this stepwise motion and how it can change the color of a chord by moving the root out and then letting other notes kind of slide into new positions. You get interesting new resolutions. And so I have that exact same thing there, right? And then even that B flat to C, I think that actually occurs. Does that occur in this piece? No, there was one of the other pieces that had that exact motion in it. Yeah, that's this is an example of this sort of unconscious imitation that's going to take place. You're always influenced by the music you've heard, and any jazz musician who's writing this kind of music has heard Wayne Shorter, and that music has influenced us. Here's another half-step motion. Right? That D going to D flat. But in doing that, check out what happens voice leading wise. The F stays the same. D goes to D flat. B flat goes up to C. F stays F. If we had an A in here also, if I played A to A flat, I could have interesting voice leading connecting these chords and get those sounds, even though those chords have nothing to do with each other functionally. There's no key that has both B flat major and D flat major in it. There's no key that I can use to relate those two chords, especially when you look at the surrounding chords, right? Whatever key has B flat in it, it doesn't have C major in it, unless it was the key of F, I guess. So this idea that these chords are being used for their individual sounds, not because of functional harmony. I'm giving all this credit to Wayne Shorter here, but I mean, those of you who aren't jazz people, you're like listening to this and going, yeah, what does all this stuff have to do with me? Debussy, right? I mean, Stravinsky, any number of people around, and this is like 50 years earlier, 60 years earlier than when Wayne Shorter is doing this. You have composers starting to explore similar ideas around the year 1900. Different classical composers who were exploring these ideas. And the thing is, like Debussy and Stravinsky, I think hit on a particular middle ground where they were also expanding the language of harmony, but not totally leaving it for atonality. And there was a set of music being written around that time that was exploring there, and at some point, purely atonal music started to maybe take over what the average composer was doing, and this idea of exploring these interesting harmonic sounds, it didn't really, that thread wasn't picked up so much. I'm probably ignoring any number of composers who actually did, but they're not the ones who make it into the history books, right? But these sounds are very much now a part of things like movie scores. Movie scores typically borrow tons of these kinds of jazz harmonies, these types of lush voicings, these non-functional harmonies, and using these kinds of sounds to create different kinds of sonic textures. So, this kind of stuff is quite... it took a while for that classical thread of doing this and the jazz thread of doing this to kind of rejoin together. And sort of create what is sometimes called the third stream. Gunther Schuller and some other people, Gil Evans, who actually predate Wayne Shorter's experimenting with this, but the idea of bringing jazz sounds and classical sounds together, and then Wayne adding a new level of harmonic sophistication to it or innovation to it, this has now become the world in which the modern composer lives. A modern composer today lives in these worlds. They know the classical tradition of Bach and Beethoven and the stuff you learn in music theory class. You know a certain amount about jazz, whether you're a jazz musician or not, but you also are aware of the way that these sounds have come together in modern film music, and not just film music, lots of music that uses these sounds now, that we can be atonal when we want to be atonal, we can be totally tonal when we want to be totally tonal, and we can have this expanded harmonic palette when we want this expanded harmonic palette. This is, to me, I don't mean my piece here in particular, but this type of approach to music, of being able to draw from all of these elements, this is what I'm about, and this is the sort of stuff that I'm trying to instill. And so I'm like always taking little bits and pieces of it. Here, let me show you this, let me show you this, let me show you this, let me show you this. This here is showing how everything kind of comes together in ways that maybe we haven't really talked about, like what are you going to do with all these random things here. Yeah. So let me just talk a little bit more here about this piece, and then I'm going to play another piece, and then we'll go. So this piece here, I mentioned this idea of taking a harmonic idea or a melodic idea and harmonizing it differently. Well, let's look at what happens here at the very beginning. Okay, if I were to put chords on this, this is some kind of A flat major 7 chord. This here is some sort of G flat major 7 chord with an A natural in it for some reason. This guy here is some sort of E flat chord and some sort of A minor chord. At letter A, I have that exact same melody, but totally different chords. This is that same chord here, but with an E added below it, which now totally changes your harmonic notion of what's going on. At the beginning, we think, oh, it's some A flat type of chord going to some sort of G flat kind of chord, but at letter A, it's an E chord going to an E flat chord. Same melody, different harmonies. In the second measure, it was E flat to A minor, but at letter A, it's B flat to C, right? So all sorts of places where you use the same, where I'm using the same melody. Here again, I've got, this is basically a G minor kind of sound going to a C major sound. And here I have B flat going to D flat. Same melody, totally different chords. Here I have E7 to D, which makes no harmonic sense but sounds nice. But in the repetition of it, it's G to F sharp 7. So this taking the same melody, finding different harmonic possibilities. Again, we saw Wayne doing that. Here's me doing that same thing. So yes, and absolutely, Graham, you're absolutely right to point out these modern composers. And I'm not as familiar with the choral world, so I don't know the first two. But of course, I do know Eric Whitacre, and I've talked about him some. And yeah, Eric Whitacre is this type of composer, right? Someone who has their foot in all of the in all these different worlds and is able to bring them together, right? Eric Whitacre is able to write something that sounds convincingly Renaissance-y or convincingly chorale-like or, very atonal and lots of places in between. He's someone who's able to bring all these things together. Now, different, challenging to sing. I'm glad you brought that up because this is how I'm going to end here. I'm going to show you a song that I wrote. If I find it here, where did it go? I did write a song called Where Did It Go, but it's not that one. I'm going to show you a piece of mine that, yeah, it's hard to sing. No getting around it. Shoot. Shoot. Where are you? Got to bring it up. It's under MuseScore 2. Lead sheets. And let me search by name. It's called Nothing to Do with You. So this is a piece that I wrote that's a song. And yeah, it's challenging to sing. I will absolutely own that. And let me just make sure I didn't accidentally close the window I need here. No, I didn't close my important windows. Okay, so this is a piece that I wrote years ago, and it uses a lot of these ideas. And yeah, it's a pain in the butt to sing. Absolute pain in the butt to sing. But you can have fun with it. This is, if nothing else, a fun tune that I'm going to leave you with here. So I'm going to play it for you, and then we'll go. I want to have nothing to do with you. I don't want to go with you running your errands. Take your cat to the vet, make a stop at the bank, or wait in the line with you at the post office. I don't even want to help you shop for presents for your niece and nephew too. I want to have nothing to do with you. I don't want to meet all your social commitments. Attend the PTA luncheon or your office party, or be your bridge partner for the charity tournament. Because when we have a list of 500,000 things that we think we have to do, we don't have time to simply be together and enjoy each other's company, or do silly things just for fun. Play on the swings, take a walk in the park, climb a mountain if we're feeling ambitious, or maybe just lie in bed all afternoon. Have you ever been sailing on a day when there isn't any wind? You just drift along aimlessly, nowhere to go, not even making good time. That would be divine. I love having nothing to do with you. I don't want to get to the chores round the house, scrub the scum off the bathtub, hang the clothes on the line, mow the lawn, pay the mortgage, or empty the dishwasher. Well, I know the world won't stop for us completely, just because we want it to. So we'll do what we should, though I want you to know I'd rather have nothing to do with you. There you go. Blossom Dearie, yeah, it's got Blossom Dearie in it. It's got Dave Frischberg in it. Dave Frischberg is the guy I had in mind lyrically, but Dave and Blossom were, birds of a feather there. So anyhow, harmonically, I could jump into this, but you can just see all sorts of crazy places, right? G major seven, B flat major seven, B7, A flat major seven. That's Wayne Shorter there. Harmonically speaking, this is Wayne Shorter. The melodies make it really difficult to sing because they don't stick in a key, but it's still a good melody. I think I can sing it, and I'm a terrible singer, right? Anyhow, there you go. Wayne Shorter, we will miss you greatly, your contributions to music, and thank you so much for all you've brought. Thank all of you here for hanging with me and checking out this tribute to Wayne and just an exploration of what made his music unique and influential. Next week we'll be back with some other exploration of music. I am going to take a look at Rod Woodhouse's Symphony in Progress, which is just coming along really nicely. Lots of interesting things happening there. And we're also going to start, I've mentioned about my basic music theory course, where we're really just getting the fundamentals down, making sure you know major scales, triads, etc. So we're going to do kind of a cohort of that. So you can expect that some of these master classes here will really be just an exploration of really basic concepts and see if we can eventually build up to doing things, at the level of sophistication of what we've been talking about today. So thanks everyone, and I will see you next time.